Hello everyone, my name is Annika Bergman Rosamond and I work at University of Edinburgh. I've written an article titled The Protection of Cultural Property in Times of Armed Conflict, looking at ethics, gender and coloniality. In this article, I make the broad claim that the international community has tended to treat the protection of cultural heritage as a global peace strategy. The protection of cultural heritage from armed conflict and other forms of destruction is often sold to global audiences as a way of avoiding humanity being fragmented into conflictual antagonistic spaces. By promoting cultural property protection as a way of furthering a shared sense of humanity, which transcends national dividing lines, we can add to the more cosmopolitan world order that UNESCO, amongst others, envisaged in the 1940s. Within that world order, there is a sense of all of us having some form of obligation to protect cultural heritage from destruction. This normative obligation indeed is present in a range of international conventions and international law. Despite this broad, peaceful obligation, the politics of cultural protection is marked by tensions and contestations. Cultural heritage sites and national cultural treasures are frequently targeted in war and conflict. Cultural cleansing of this order is detrimental to the peaceful and cosmopolitan ambitions of UNESCO, as I noted earlier, with UNESCO often being seen as the vanguard of global heritage protection. It's also inconsistent with the ambitions of the Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict, adopted in 1954 and amended in 1999, as well as being inconsistent with the UNESCO World Heritage Convention. The protection of cultural property and cultural heritage is then, I would argue, rooted in a broad cosmopolitan agenda, which is also a claim I made elsewhere in my research, as well as a militarized practice. Increasingly, Western states, as well as Western militaries, have taken it upon themselves to protect the destruction of cultural heritage in armed conflict through militarized responses. Yet, if we unpack the many documents and texts telling us the story about cultural protection, then we can establish that cultural protection is envisaged as an ethical endeavor. An ethical endeavor that is rooted in a Western universalist tradition, rather than being sensitive to the ethical traditions and localized experiences of individuals and other actors in the non-Western world. As such, cultural protection is defined not only by ethical obligation to distant others, but also by gendered and neo-colonial dynamics. Notions of protecting cultural heritage from destruction in war and conflict often rest on Western experiences and conceptions of rights and obligation, as well as Western forms of knowledge and expertise pertaining to cultural protection. Gender dynamics also surround cultural protection. It's quite often assumed in key texts on cultural protection, though not necessarily spelled out, that Western actors somehow are more rational, more competent, and more willing and capable of offering protection of threatened heritage sites, not least in times of war. In this process, non-Western actors are feminized. They're seeing their knowledge and ability to protect their own cultural treasures being reduced. In this process, I would argue, masculinist notions of protection are being employed, not least by Western militaries. There is also gendered language being employed in key conventions on heritage protection. For example, the discursive signifier of mankind, with there being an assumption that somehow humanity is equated with mankind. And this is a historical perception that emerged in the 1940s and earlier, but that has not been revised in key documents such as the UNESCO Constitution or the UNESCO World Heritage Convention. In capturing these gendered and colonial logics that underpin heritage protection, I draw upon critical heritage studies, critiques of cosmopolitan thinking, as well as feminist international relations scholarship and feminist ethical scholarship. Amongst other things, I investigate the coloniality that prevails in texts and practices pertaining to cultural protection in armed conflict. I note that non-Western states and nations, in the context of cultural protection, are continuously subordinated and often being assigned the characteristics of chaos and corruption, setting them apart from the civilized West. I'm arguing that these broad colonial characterizations very much inform military protection of heritage. I also show that national militaries and international organizations, though committed to ending the destruction of cultural heritage in armed conflict, tend to employ these colonial assumptions. And despite there being more insight into the damaging effects of employing such gendered and colonial assumptions, there is still a good number of gendered and colonial undertones embedded in policies and practices of protection of cultural heritage in armed conflict. With this in mind, I seek to make two distinct contributions in my article. First of all, I offer a critical assessment of the Western liberal cosmopolitan tradition that I argue undergirds heritage protection. And in so doing, I employ a gender and colonial lens. And moreover, I propose that an alternative ethical framework that takes account of feminist ethical and decolonial ethical reasoning could be productive as a platform of rethinking cultural protection in terms of armed conflict. And it's productive because it's sensitive to care relations but also to the embodied lived experiences of many civilians and soldiers exposed to cultural destruction. I also offer a feminist narrative analysis of cultural protection, drawing upon, for example, the work by Annika Bergman, Laura Shepherd, but also the kind of work that I've done myself in previous scholarship. I look both at the broader storytelling surrounding heritage protection, as well as the distinct narration of military heritage protection. I argue that there is insufficient attention being paid to heritage protection through a distinct feminist narrative lens, while recognizing that scholars such as Maria Wendt and Cecilia Åse have commenced this analytical and methodological process. I argue and I demonstrate that a feminist narrative analysis of cultural protection provides new insights into this specific field of scholarship. I look at and identify the fabula, the key characters, the characterizations, and the plots employed in storytelling pertaining to cultural protection. Informed by feminist methodological approaches and feminist notions of narrative analysis, I both identify what is being said in key documents as well as silences in the narration of heritage protection. First, as noted earlier, I zoom in on the wider storytelling that surrounds heritage protection, unpacking the ethical, gendered, and colonial assumptions employed in such narratives. For example, by looking at UNESCO Constitution, The Hague, and the UNESCO World Heritage Conventions, identifying both gendered and colonial language being employed in these key documents, and also noting that these documents have not been amended so as to take account of decoloniality and sensitivity to gendered forms of oppression. For example, and as noted earlier, mankind is still used as a signifier to describe humanity. And Western notions of cosmopolitanism are privileged over other forms of ethical engagement. Nor is there any distinct reflection on gender and coloniality in the aforementioned texts, producing storytelling that is both gendered and neocolonial in character. In the second instance, I unpack the narration of military protection in the UNESCO Military Manual, published in 2016. I specifically attend to the ethical underpinnings and the gendered and colonial dynamics of that storytelling. I identify key protagonists in the storytelling, and I argue that these are, for the most part, Western military commanders that are assumed to possess a whole range of protection skills, not the least the ability to translate international law into military practice and ensuring that subordinates are able to implement international law as it pertains to cultural protection. I also argue that in the military manual, there is a distinct lack of attention to lived experiences of war, as well as local forms of expertise on protection of cultural heritage. Rather, Western forms of masculinist protection are being furthered in the document, as well as Western forms of military knowledge, producing a very particular form of storytelling in the UNESCO military manual. I conclude my article by arguing for a feminist ethical approach to heritage protection, not least because such an approach would very much enable us to engage with embodied experiences of heritage in times of war and in times of conflict. So these were some of the aspects that I investigate in my article, and I hope that you will read the article and that you'll find it interesting and that you will engage with it.